Hello and welcome to the HR People Pod, the CIPD's fortnightly podcast, bringing you the topical stories and expert insights on the world of work impacting the profession. My name is David D'Souza. I am Director of Profession at the CIPD, and joining me in the studio today we have
Laura Callahan from Willow HR Consulting,
Bruce Daisley, Workplace Culture Consultant,
Garen Rouch, Organisation Development Consultant, and a lot of things for the CIPD as well.
a lot of things for the CIPD. And Bruce, you obviously also have your own podcast as well.
Yeah, that's right. I jettisoned a career in tech, working at Twitter before that guy, and do a podcast called Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat.
Which is, if you haven't listened to it, well worth a listen. It's humiliating enough having people more qualified than me talking about HR, but having someone also who's better at hosting a podcast in this is just really the team doing me dirty in the run-up to Christmas. So before we kick off today, I just wanted to do something a little bit different, which is we've seen a number of stories in the press recently about the value of HR. And I wanted to get an instinctive kind of view from you as to how it feels when you see that type of thing appearing. There's been a framing of HR as running a shadow empire, which gives us an incredible amount of power. Actually, when you think about it, we should probably use that in slightly different ways. But when you see that, how does it feel? We're going to come back and we're going to do a special in the new year. But Laura, if I come to you first.
How it feels for me is I don't think there's a great understanding of what HR is actually there to do, and a misunderstanding as to whether what our purpose in an organisation is.
Yeah, I think it demonstrates that there's clearly a lot of more perceived power of HR, and other people inside organisations are a bit threatened by that. So I think it demonstrates, firstly, that HR themes and people themes are on the rise, and the question then becomes, how can these themes be owned across organisations rather than just felt like it's a fiefdom of HR, I think.
It's an HR fiefdom, indeed.
I just think, HR's getting dragged into the culture war. If it's potentially, it's a really good opportunity for us as a profession to step up and really sort of go about how we are evidence-based and we do make a significant impact. I guess if we are being painted as the evil empire, then I guess the CIPD is the Death Star. So what can the CIPD to try and put this right, to really sort of state the case for HR, to really sort of say that it does create value? And the way it's grown is a reflection of how our organisations have become more complex as well.
And how culture has changed and people's expectations of what they receive at work. It's not that transactional, I work, I receive pay anymore. We've got far greater expectations of how you need to protect my well-being, you need to give me a future, you need to invest in me. If I'm investing in you, you invest in me. And so those reciprocal relationships are much more on the agenda than they ever have been before.
Yeah. So at the CIPD, I can assure people that what we don't do is plot which planets we'd like to destroy to make sure that we rule with fear. But one of the things that I think it is very much our job to do is to continue to make the case for the profession and the value it adds and the complexity of the work and the expertise that is needed to do that. So we're going to come back to that in the new year, but I just want people to know, one, that we're aware that that's happening, and secondly, that we are absolutely confident in the value of the work that you do and the way it's approached. But we have a special guest today joining us as well, which is Lizzie Crowley, who's our skills advisor at the CIPD. I'm going to talk a little bit in depth about reports, but Lizzie, you're also going to be the first person that I come to ask what's going to be your choice of Christmas movie this year? What's the one that you're really looking forward to watching?
Ooh, Die Hard, maybe. I mean, there's a big debate about whether it is a Christmas movie, but, I'd be strongly coming on down the side that it is.
So, first of all, there isn't a debate about
controversial
whether Die Hard is a Christmas movie. There's a group of people who haven't yet recognised it and they need educating, but I don't think there's a debate around that. So one vote for Die Hard.
I'm the father of two young girls, 6 and 3. So
Die Hard.
It's Frozen all the way, followed by every other Christmas movie you can think of.
Do you know what? My daughter used to love Frozen so much that I used to take her down, give my wife a line on a Saturday morning. And one time my wife came down at 9 o'clock and I was already into my third watching of Frozen. Oh, I was just sitting there like blank, staring out.
I feel for you.
Indeed, I feel for you. Luckily, my daughter's grown past that a bit.
I've never seen Elf.
You've never seen Elf?
Never seen Elf. And every year I say to myself, I'm going to watch Elf this year. And I never do. I never get round to watching Elf. Would you recommend?
It's pure
I can't
joy.
stand that guy.
It's pure joy. So I came into this with a lot of respect for you, Bruce, and that's dissipated almost.
Do you like Will Ferrell though? There's something about him that proper like
it doesn't matter
least trust levels of disdain. I cannot stand that
guy. So it's just magical. Okay. And I would suggest, like, if you've got any joy in your heart, then watching it you should do, because it is a perfect vehicle for him not to engender your disdain, but for you to kind of fish out of water. It's amazing.
Okay. This year's the year.
Right. Elf, Die Hard, Frozen, and
I also have never seen Elf. So yeah, I don't have the same level of disdain for Will Ferrell. However, I've never taken an opportunity to watch it.
Let's do it this year.
Yeah, absolutely. So I also commit to watch Elf, but Home Alone has definitely got to be top of our list. My son loves to see people hurt themselves and cause great pain. So yeah, we find that hilarious.
It's just got a sinister turn, hasn't it? One thing I would say is, Will Ferrell, if you are listening to this podcast, we don't regularly come for you. Most of our guests are pro Will Ferrell. We try and check that before we invite them on. Bruce has somehow slipped through that net.
Have you seen Anchorman 2? One of the worst films ever made.
In fairness, Anchorman 2, that escalated quite poorly. And I want to make a shout out to Christmas films that people may not realise are Christmas films. So Die Hard, as I say, everyone gets it's a Christmas film, and some people are just wrong. But Jaws: The Revenge is set over the Christmas period. That's worth a watch. One of the worst movies ever. Michael Caine, when asked about whether he'd actually watched it back because he's in it, said, "I haven't seen the film, but I have seen The House It Built My Mother, and it's absolutely fantastic." And then at Gremlins as well.
I love Gremlins.
People forget that. Definitely. So, Lizzie, that Gremlins seems a natural sake to what we're going to talk about with you for no apparent reason, which is at the end of November, the government published the Get Britain Working white paper, outlining a range of proposals to reform employment, health and skills support in the UK. The goal is to address economic inactivity, productivity and quality of work. But one of the key focus points is around young people. And I know that we've just released a report and you're the brains behind it. I wanted to give you a chance to talk about some of the things that we've discovered in that report, and then give people a chance to discuss actually what they think the implications are for workplaces. So if you could give us some highlights, that'd be amazing.
Well, I think kind of one of the biggest things that we found looking at changes in the youth labour market over the last 20 to 30 years has been the massive decline in the proportion of young people who combine education and employment. So although we've got greater and rising levels of economic inactivity amongst young people who are outside of the labour market, it is actually the large collapse in the proportion of young people who combine earning and learning that is driving the collapse in employment rates amongst young people. We also sort of identified that actually, although there's a real need for a strong alternative pathway to the higher education system, just 6% of young people, are in an apprenticeship now, participating in one, and that's the same figure as 20 years ago. So although we kind of welcome the government's announcements to provide additional support or coordinated offer for 18 to 21-year-olds, we feel that there needs to be a much bolder action to unlock apprenticeship opportunities for young people via an apprenticeship guarantee is one of the things we're calling for.
I mean, that's a remarkable stat, isn't it? No shift in the number of people doing apprenticeships, or percentage of people, I imagine, over the last 20 years. Any thoughts on what else should be done or how this is playing out in organisations?
I'm a big fan of micro measures like this. I think genuinely they work. It's really interestingly, as I was on my way in, all of this is in service of that 9 million economically inactive people, and these I think about 2.5 million people on long-term sick. Today, John Byrne-Murdoch from the FT, who's becoming a national treasure actually for the way he uses data and analysis, has published an analysis saying he thinks the number is substantially overcounted, and he says for two reasons. He says, firstly, it draws from the GB Labour Force survey, and he says that data The response rates are falling very strongly over the course of the last few years. He makes a comparison to the UK household longitudinal study, and he said if you take that, economic activity is about the same as 2019. He says in combination with that, the incentive to be signed off unemployment benefit and onto incapacity benefit has increased because the assessment has gone online only in the last few years. So people are filling out a form, they're getting the form online, and they're getting more money. He says effectively if you address that, this economic inactivity will turn out to be a mirage. So it's an interesting thing. I'm strongly in favour of these youth schemes, but I suspect the national anxiety that we've got maybe is a statistical aberration rather than necessarily a societal one.
And there's quite a few interesting pieces at the moment around the reliability of strats at that labour force level, aren't there? But I think it's really interesting is that you would always want to increase economic activity. That's potentially slightly different to those measures of economic inactivity, isn't it? So definitely the diagnosis, you can have questions over that, but the intent probably always push towards.
Yeah, and I think the fact that it's still, obviously Bruce's numbers, it's good that we're challenging the numbers before we even start coming up with solutions for it as well. I think, there's a lot of very smart people with very big budgets that have tried to shift that number before from 6%, and it's continually failed. And if you do look at other countries like Switzerland, where it's like 2/3 of the youth are actually in apprenticeships, so there's a huge number. So the model does work. I think if you actually look inside organisations about what happens, we have to think about, it's the talent operating model. So what is it that we're doing when we're bringing apprenticeships on board? We've got to develop them. And I think part of the challenge is that, and the challenge for HR is that we're not geared up to develop raw talent at scale. And often, I sort of speak to quite a few HR people, and a lot of the apprenticeship schemes, it's so variable, the quality. Some are excellent, some are negligent, seen as sort of cheap pair of hands and sort of deposited into a team and left and not rotated or looked after. And also there's so many managers, that are accidental managers. They're not ready to be or not, ready to actually develop and really know what's required to actually develop people through as well. So I think there's a lot to be done. It's one of those things, it's such a big problem, it's a systemic problem. There's not going to be one silver bullet that actually moves this. There's going to be a whole aggregate build-up of different solutions.
And that's exactly what, because within my consultancy, we predominantly deal with businesses that don't have HR teams. And so they're absolutely terrified to bring in somebody who requires such structured learning because they don't feel as though they have the skills themselves to support them, nor the time and the resources to do that. So for them, there's a fear factor over, can I actually deliver what this person needs? So the thought of that structured environment that they don't have anyone internally who can be providing. So there is definitely a fear within the SMEs that don't have HR teams.
Yeah, and this is an opportunity to do generation bashing either. Like we look at the new generation coming through. I came through and I worked and studied at the same time, and yet I cost my organisation a huge amount because I couldn't work a fax machine and kept sending through blank copies of a contract. So there's no guarantee of quality in there, but I think it's just like giving people the right environment to actually excel and develop, but giving them the time to do it as well.
And we need to train people on fax machines.
Luckily that's not a thing anymore. I just show my age.
I'm still baffled on how a fax machine works.
If anyone's listening to this podcast and they're like, what is a fax machine? Wikipedia is your friend on that one, and you'll see a picture and you'll go, surely not. It's also worth recounting that by the end of the era of the fax machine, all anyone was receiving was lists of potential hire cards sent to spam. Some people will remember that fondly because it would just start going in the corner and you'd be like, what's that? We still have a fax machine. What is it? It's spam. Lizzie, if we kind of conclude this section not on fax machines but on kind of calls to government, first of all, I'd urge everyone to go and have a look at the paper if you're interested in this. If you are interested in the problems and a proper diagnosis of it and feedback on it and structured thinking, please do have a look. But what would your kind of key takeaways for people be and the calls that we're making?
Well, I think kind of one of the big things is we need to ensure that young people are actually building the skills that employers highly value when they're in the education system. That means giving them enough opportunities to, trial and test out ways, for instance, of teamwork, problem solving, and building their communication skills. We don't focus on that currently enough within the education system, and that will improve the transition into employment. Secondly, we need to really unlock more apprenticeship opportunities for young people. On this area, we feel that there should be wage incentives and additional wraparound support for SMEs in particular to overcome some of those barriers that were already highlighted in this segment. And thirdly, as a way to boost that, is to introduce an apprenticeship guarantee for all young people aged 16 to 24 to really boost that pathway and create a viable alternative to the university route.
Perfect. Lizzie, thank you so much for your time this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
So, moving on, we're going to take a moment to look at the trends, challenges, and opportunities that will shape the year ahead. So we're coming to the end of this year. It's been a roller coaster, lots going on, but there have been shifts in technology, there's been shifts in politics, there's been shifts in geopolitics. There's a whole range of things that have been happening. As we look into 2025, which feels like it's the future and technically is for a few more weeks, I guess. As we look to 2025, if you kind of like peer into your crystal ball, what do you see kind of as challenges, opportunities, things we need to be looking at?
My views is really prioritising the employee experience, because recently on a panel discussion within private sector industry, it's not all about the money anymore. It's about the money, but it's not all about the money. So we've got to be looking at what is it that people are wanting and needing and looking for from their employers in order to attract great talent and retain them. So we need to be looking far more at things such as having great development plans, individual conversations about mutually beneficial experiences, and coming away from just thinking about our remuneration packages and how we're rewarding people in that way. I'm seeing that the fantastic companies that are doing great things and achieving great things are focusing more around the employee experience, and especially considering we're seeing budgets getting cut, everything's becoming more expensive, and employment and costs to employ people get higher and higher. It's a great opportunity to be looking at these things that perhaps take more resource but aren't about kind of benefit schemes and just what you can pay people. So that's far more important.
And there's a piece there very much just joining it up to what was discussed earlier, isn't there, around management capability as well. So you may not be able to pay upper quartile, but if you can give people upper quartile leadership, management and development support, that's one, attractive, but secondly, that's growing your capability over time as well.
And the way I describe it really simply is to say, like, right, this is what I need you to achieve. These are the things that I need you to deliver. What do you want out of me? How can we make this worthwhile for you? And people will stick around for far longer if they feel as though that person understands what I'm looking for and I'm delivering something for them and they're delivering something for me. I'm getting something out of it. You'll hang on to people for far, far longer in that way.
I think I fully agree with that. The work to some extent has, for some people, is feeling transactional. And, amongst people's friends, they say, oh yeah, the culture's not the same, the experience here isn't the same. And so organisations that can elevate themselves from that will get a strong word of mouth and will get a strong employee experience. I spent a little while last week going through hundreds of trend decks, or it's certainly dozens of trend decks, and the things that come out, firstly, yellow's going to have a massive year next year, like
the Coldplay single or
the colour.
Oh, right, okay.
People are saying yellow's too basic. No way, but yellow's going to have a massive year. But secondly, one of the things that comes out in the trend decks is the leadership discourse about AI is creating some frustration with employees, because a lot of employees feel like AI is being talked about, but we've got no strategy inside our organisation. I think, in the last 12 months, we have seen organisations break out, like Klarna said that they replaced 700 employees with AI. And those stories, I think, are going to become more and more common, that if we're looking and the grass is greener on the other side, there's going to be more organisations saying, actually, now they're getting strategic benefit from AI. And it will make the organisations that are still trying to work it out feel a bit more flat-footed. So I think big differentiators are going to be culture and employee experience, and organisations who are meaningfully making a benefit from AI, because most won't be.
And that AI point's a really interesting one. We'll be doing quite a lot of work. You'll see it's January, February, March, we've got a concerted kind of focus on it. But the AI one's really interesting because people quite often, their experience of using it is individual, but what the impact will be in organisations will be quite often be part of an enterprise roadmap, won't it? Rather than so it will be, we're changing our entire contact centre approach due to this, rather than we're going to give you access to ChatGPT and that's what's going to change your world.
I see it as we're the BitTorrent era of AI. And what I mean by that is of course, I wouldn't want to talk about illegality, but there are a lot of people who downloaded movies and music illegally via BitTorrent, and it's quite popular. But you were self-taught because it was quite esoteric. It was quite complex to do it, and so if you invested the time, there was a meaningful bounty. But it was not a mainstream product. When Spotify came along, when Apple Music, when Netflix came along, it made these things very easy. They were very easily packaged, and we could get the benefit with one click, a little search. We're not yet at that Spotify, Netflix era. We're still at the BitTorrent era, where, for illustration, 99% of college students are using AI. Why? Because the gap between the personal benefit to them and the effort being put in is definitely worthwhile. In organisations, I did some work with a professional services organisation 2 weeks ago. They've got their own AI, they spent loads of money on it, but people are having one go, it doesn't work as they wanted. There's no incentive for them to spend 12 hours getting up to scratch on understanding the foibles, so they're not using it. And so we're still at that BitTorrent era of AI. And I think we're going to start hearing from organisations or competitors who are getting the benefit, and we're going to be like, yeah, we should have invested a bit at that time. So I think there's going to be a lot of anxious comparison next year.
Interesting. And that accessibility bit is key, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So we've had BitTorrent and we've had fax machines so far. It feels like an unexpected throwback episode.
Yeah. Well, I guess just building on the point about AI, because I think it's one of those things, I think everyone's talking about it even if they don't know what to do with it as well. But just looking on the big four, what they're leading on, if you look at their front pages of the consultancies, they're leading on AI. And generally that does create a lot of contextual force for organisations to follow. I think we're probably at peak agile, whatever that means in your organisation. So we then start and go in a bit of a process hunting for a new fad, which is potentially quite dangerous, making sure that what we do next is evidence-based. I think some of the challenges we've got out there at the moment, there's been so much brilliant work done by so many courageous individuals around ED&I, and we're at a real tipping point now. We have to make the case. We have to make it really strongly that it works, and it does make a big difference. And we don't get led away by, all the different headlines that we're seeing, because it is an easy thing to kick out as well. So that's really important. And I think, just from our perspective as organisation development practitioners out in the field, I think one of the big challenges is that organisations are so drawn into the short term right now. So many priorities, shifting so much so quickly. We don't see things through. Organisations don't take the time to slow down, to think through the implicative effect of their decisions. Initiatives only last 1-2 years before you even bear the fruit of what they're trying to do. So I guess it's a prediction, but it's also a hope and a wish that organisations do start to slow down and do start to apply more participative decision making and just more thought into how they actually make decisions.
There's a story about Russian coders that's in Flash Boys by Michael Lewis. It's absolutely brilliant. I quite often use the comparison to HR, but I'm not going to do it in this podcast because we don't have time. So I'll come back in a future podcast and I will talk about Russian coders. But just to come back to your point around the length of initiatives, there's something in there, right? So if you say to an organisation it will take 2 to 3 years to see the fruits of your labour, that does two things actually. It manages the organisation's expectations potentially, but it can also, I think, detract from us being able to articulate and be really critical about whether the work we're doing is making a difference. So culture can change actually, I think, quite rapidly in some organisations. If your working assumption is this is going to be 4 to 5 years, I think actually as practitioners we need to lean into that part around evidence-based delivery, focus on productivity, to enable us to have the credibility around the long burn, because otherwise it's a bit jam tomorrow the entire time, isn't it? I think the one thing I'd say, because I'm in the type of job where I quite often get asked at this time of year about two things, and we're going to come on to Christmas parties next. But the other thing I get asked is what are my predictions for next year? And I always make one of my predictions being that there will be some other external event that triggers a change that people aren't anticipating, because quite often it's easy to be quite insular. So I've got a piece I wrote in 2019 where I go, something will probably happen next year that changes everything that we need to react to. That wasn't me being smart ahead of that. I'd written the same piece in 2018, 2017. It'll be the same this year. There'll be an economic shock. There'll be something which forces organisations not to think, what are Google doing currently and should we copy it, but actually have to change the way that they're approaching things because it fundamentally impacts their business. That may be, to your point around AI, that may be that actually gains traction next year, and suddenly there's a need to adjust and adapt to that. But I think we quite often look at the stuff within our control rather than looking at the external environment, the potential shifts, and our need to often work that back, which to your point around peak agile. Agile's a number of different things, and whether it's a noun or an adverb is kind of an important distinction. But there's no doubt that actually the ability of organisations to be able to adapt to their external environment changing has always been important, but never more so than now. Festive period can be a brilliant chance to bring people together. Lots of organisations celebrate that by bringing their employees together. Being really blunt, historically, that's also been combined quite often with large amounts of alcohol being consumed and with an expectation of poor behaviour. We've covered, in particular, sexual harassment and poor behaviour and evaluating risk in organisations in quite a bit of depth in the podcast. If you go back to episode 8, you'll find a kind of cool bit of the episode on that in depth, but we've touched on it relatively. But the challenges for organisations shift when people come together socially with alcohol in a relaxed environment. What do practitioners need to be thinking about this time of year so that we aren't spending our entire time thinking about how can we make this less fun for people, but we're thinking about how do we create an event or a space where people can really celebrate their work?
I think
it's gone straight. There's a nervous giggle coming from my left.
It's just one of those subjects where it's like HR is in the wrong place around this. I think when you think about what it is that you're trying to do with the Christmas party, I think you have to go back to first principles. What is the task? What is it trying to do? Is it trying to build an inclusive environment? Is it trying to reward our employees for working so hard all year? Is it enough? Are we trying to build a bond so that everyone feels bonded enough that whenever it goes back to hybrid work in the new year, we all feel close and a part of the organisation? If it's those things, then Christmas parties aren't necessarily the answer, because they're not any of those things. They are for some, and I'm being very mindful here because my 23-year-old self would think very differently about Christmas parties to how I feel now, because obviously I'm on the other side, whereas it was a great opportunity to let your hair down and it was great, but even then you could tell it wasn't for everyone. And I think people have different responsibilities outside of work. If you want to say thank you to people, you can say thank you in different ways. And I think there's just so many tactics you can do. So just a big shout out to Judith Flashman at the House of Commons. She gave me loads of tactics. She was like, downplay Christmas, celebrate the party, really don't necessarily front load the fact that it's about alcohol, but really emphasize the fact that there's a juice bar. Don't lay drinks on straight after people have finished because they have an empty stomach. All these things that you've got to stack the odds of probability that it won't go the way that it will. And also just it's the role of senior managers in it as well, like the role modelling. I think the problem that because HR needs to get all those valuable bits, it needs to have good relationships with people, but it is not positioned in the right way when it's policing people and holding people's hair out if they're sick. That's not where it needs to be. And so we need to be very careful we don't accept that invitation to be that person, and that responsibility is shared with others.
I definitely would agree with that. And let's not let the few spoil it for the many. And there are many teams out there who want to socialise, and whether that's going to the pub as a small team or hiring a big event space. But what HR does have a responsibility to do is to support people to understand what the expectations are, and so being very clear to people that it's still work time. Surprisingly, many people don't know that, and so reminding them about that and being clear about behaviours is doing them a favour, so it stops them from kind of getting into trouble in the first place. Unfortunately, I've dealt with many fallouts from Christmas parties in the past, and being really upfront about those expectations does do everybody quite a favour, and making sure that you swiftly deal with if there is somebody who's taking it a bit too far, if there is somebody who's misstepping, that you swiftly kind of deal with that there and then, so that it is more inclusive, so that people at the party, everybody can enjoy themselves in the same way.
Yeah, and it's difficult for less experienced HR people that maybe haven't developed the professional boundaries that they need, where they're still in that place where they still, you've got friends and those boundaries aren't clear. And that is a really difficult time, isn't it? So I think there's a lot we can do as a profession to support newer sort of members that are getting involved in this, to help support them.
I definitely think this is an area where leaders need to take a step up, because if the message is just coming from HR, then it just
100%.
looks like HR are ruining the part. Here they go, health and safety, like they're sort of stepping in. So the message needs to come from leadership. Broadly, if you remember that culture, a lovely definition of culture is that culture is the behaviours of an organisation, whether encouraged, rewarded or tolerated. And it's the tolerated part that's the really critical part here. And look, the big issues with Christmas parties are principally when power dynamics and misbehaviour come into that. And so it's all about leaders reminding people, I want to remind you that this is an opportunity to have fun and to have a laugh. Go ahead and do it, but strong rules apply. And normally cultural mishaps, things that go wrong, are when someone who's senior has done something inappropriate, or someone middle management has done something inappropriate, and a blind eye's turned to it, and all of a sudden that's become the new culture. And so, that's my view on these things. I think they can be one of the best forms of bonding. If the message just comes from HR, then you've already lost.
And definitely having an idea around what you want your work event to be, exactly around what's the objective of this event, and making sure then around how are we going to make sure that as many people as possible can feel included and can feel like it's a safe space. That kind of might feel a bit like I can literally feel the eye rolls around the country, as HR kind of brings this to the front. But that, I guarantee you from experience, is far easier to deal with than the other side of it. If you don't have that preparation and it goes wrong, is that preparation beforehand, you will thank the stars that you did that if you are then on the other side of dealing with it, and more so than ever now because of the legislation that came in October. And this stuff happens. It happens across the land every single year, and if we face into it and anticipate what can go wrong, it's going to pay dividends.
Absolutely. Every party of 100 people, there's going to be one issue that you deal with.
Absolutely.
Every single party. So getting ahead of it, making sure that you have reminded people of the rules. It's come from the big boss.
Yeah, I have the rare distinction of stopping a fight breaking out at an HR Christmas party, which is, and for obvious reasons, I cannot go into detail on this podcast. But this is just so close to home. We talked about Gremlins at the start and kind of favourite movies. I used to have a kind of Gremlins rule, which is, they go, don't feed them after midnight in Gremlins. I'm like, pull that forward to 10 o'clock. I'm like, at 10 o'clock, I always used to leave. I'm like, I don't need to be here. And that was partly just to make sure, because quite often, just being really practical to your point around people earlier in your career, it is very hard if you become part of an incident.
Oh gosh,
if you've had even a little bit to drink, but suddenly there's something happening, for you to be independent of that is really difficult. And I do think you should be able to work in HR and have friends, and you should be able to work in HR and socialise. I think actually remaining distant from an organisation is really difficult, but that point around professional boundaries is really important. I think the point that I guess everyone's making is that you have to set an expectation that it's not all right for you to have a good night if it means other people are having a really bad night. These are things that will scar people for their lives inside and outside of work. This isn't stuff got a little bit out of hand at a Christmas party, because it does. They will be memories that people carry with them throughout their lives and impact their families. And that's why the boundaries have to be drawn. But there must be a version of this where we go, we'd like everyone to celebrate, we'd like people to come together, and we'd like everyone to have a good time. That shouldn't be impossible. To your point, if you've got one person in 100 who's going to be a problem, how do you make sure that problem isn't a problem?
And most people probably already know who that person is going to be. Who your liability in your team is, let's face it. And so let's not just kind of keep tolerating it and allow it to be part of the culture. And, oh, here they go again. This is what they do every year. That's not okay.
Yeah, because then what happens is that's what happens at a Christmas party.
Yeah.
And that's not okay. So if you're listening to the podcast, we hope you're having a wonderful end to the year. We hope you're looking forward to next year. And we hope that whatever happens over the next few weeks is brilliant for you, brilliant for the people around you, and that you get a chance to relax as well. Our final piece that we do each episode is we do a piece called Is It a Thing? Where we take something that's come up in the media on a regular basis, maybe it's come up on TikTok, and we go, yeah, everyone's talking about it, but is it actually a thing that happens in organisations, or is it just a rebranding, or someone's got carried away with it? So this week we'd like to introduce the practice of malicious compliance. So that's behaviour which is a passive-aggressive protest where an individual strictly adheres to a superior's instructions. So for any of you steeped in the history of things, that there's got a bit of work to rule probably around that. So that's not new. But even when they know following those orders will lead to unintended or destructive outcomes. So you're going, look, the boss has told me to do it. I think it's really stupid. I'm going to do it anyway just to teach them a lesson. Do we think that's such a strong nodding of the head going to... from my
That
left,
is so a
like you
thing.
only did it yesterday. It's just like, yeah, my Friday afternoon, that's what I've got lined up. So
It's so a thing. It's so a thing, and it's one of those. It's a symptom of so many things underneath. There's so many drivers that create it. We deal with it a lot. We get called into organisations, and there's all sorts of things. Often we'll get called in by leaders, and they're like, maybe they're dissatisfied with the performance of their team, and we'll actually go in and then start to wind the clock back and understand what is the origin of this as well. So maybe like a case that we were working on a little while back is a good example. So often what happens when you wind the clock back, it often happens with new managers. So new managers get called in. A CEO or senior manager is frustrated with how things are. They hire a new manager, shake things up, disrupt things. They're no good. You need to really get them going. New manager comes in, tells people how to does things, but doesn't have the full context, doesn't understand why things are the way they are and how hard these other people have worked to date to get the organisation. And so they start giving out commands. And often a symptom of it is when someone says, sure, I'll do that. Could you just send me that request in email? And they will then go and do it. But it is so common. And it's probably one of the saddest things that happens in an organisation. It's it's somebody who's a brain experience and all that kind of thing, and they're checking out and they're doing something and they're basically trying to get a short-term win that's almost like a Pyrrhic victory. They're making the organisation suffer, the team suffer, and ultimately then just for the sake of that as well. But it is a really sad situation, I find.
Look, the phenomenon this year we heard of coffee badging, which is people told they've got to be in the office 3 days, so they're making journey in at 12 o'clock one day, having a coffee in the office, having a chat with a few people, heading home. Very, very common because I've witnessed it firsthand. But that's another example of this. People applying to the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law, because they think the rules are badly constructed. And I think
I guess the question is, do you need a law?
Right, but there's an interesting phenomenon right now where return to work policies are a really good example of workplace disagreement with policies is at relatively high levels. People finding that their company policy of Amazon 5 days but other places 3 days, people are thinking even for the promised team bonding, that is not what's required around here, and so they're not abiding by it. And so you witness the amount of organisations I've worked with this year who have had several return to work pushes and they haven't worked, and they've got this interesting challenge that how do they turn the screw on these? And it's an illustration of that. Broadly, if you boil it down, people don't just disagree with their bosses because they're being obstructive. They disagree with their bosses because they're like, I came all the way in, no one spoke to me all day. What was the point of me spending 12 quid getting in? And I think that's the bigger issue, that sometimes when there's a gap between what the employee thinks is right for the job and what the rule is coming from bosses, and understanding that misconnection, I think, is the bigger issue here.
It's definitely, I would agree that kind of return to work piece and return to the office piece, because it's like, okay, I'm going to travel in, I'm going to sit with my headphones on all day, and I'm not going to speak to a soul because I'm annoyed that I've been made to travel in and sit here. So if you want people to come in to collaborate, create collaborative environments, make sure that you are bringing the teams together to do that piece. It's not, and so it tends to come out from much more dictatorial type environments where people feel like they're being told what to do. And so that collaboration and understanding, right, so this is the intent behind it. So, and then having a conversation to see whether we deliver against that intent or whether we can foresee that it's not going to work for whatever reason.
Yeah. It's an expression of power.
Yeah.
And often it's because power under. But people that have power under have an enormous amount of power in organisations. It's often underestimated as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a Death Star. I didn't know that.
Who knew?
But what's also driving that to say, like, we need to do this? So that bit around everyone must be in the office 3 days a week. Why has that become so important? What are they annoyed about, or what is it they think the problem is that they're trying to fix by that? Because maybe that isn't the solution. So you've got to draw out to say, what is the most basic level of the issue, and then let's work out how to solve it, rather than somebody just thumping the desk and saying, right.
So is this might be the first kind of, is it a thing, where it seems like everyone's saying it is a thing?
Unfortunately, it's a thing.
It's a thing. Malicious compliance is a thing. We can put that in the...
It now has a name. It's definitely a thing.
I mean, it's like whatever the opposite of Room 101 is. We don't actually have a repository of things that are a thing because it's never come up before. So Excellent. It's good to hear. And the next time my team asks me to put something in email and says, can you just drop me a note with that? I'll be like, I see what you're doing. And we'll work through that. So that's all from us today. I'd like to thank our guests, Laura, Bruce and Garen. It's been an absolutely wonderful episode. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on a breadth of topics. Bruce, I'm going to give you one more chance to plug your podcast, actually, because I think it's brilliant.
Okay, I'm just coming up to 200 episodes. Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. It's a podcast about workplace culture, and I guess it's evidence-based. I try and interview people. I try and avoid leaders who are just telling how they solve the world, and try and interview people who've done research or have gathered evidence.
No, and I've been on it as well, so I recommend that episode above all others as well. But no, it's really worth a listen. So if you only listen to 3 podcasts, listen to the 2 that we do with Bruce's. We've got a wealth of resources as ever available to members, supporting you through a number of issues. And please do keep look out for communications in the new year, because we're going to do some things fundamentally different as well. I'm really excited about that, but I'll probably get in trouble with the comms team if I talk about it on here rather than actually through the channels that I should. You'll find our latest content, including some new pieces on L&D. And actually the report that Lizzie spoke about as well on the website, so do make sure that you get there. And we'll publish new episodes of this every fortnight within the new year, so do make sure to follow up. As always, I'm told to get you to subscribe and stuff and tell you where it's available, but if you're listening to this, it feels like you've already managed that. But do catch up on demand, and it's been wonderful with the reception that this podcast has had throughout the year. Please keep supporting us in the next year so that we continue to get guests of this incredible caliber coming on. My name's David Souza, and this has been the HR People Pod. Thank you very much, and see you back in 2025.